Thanks everybody for joining. My name is Matt Caponigro. I'm the product marketing manager here at TestRail. I'm really excited to be the moderator for today's panel discussion. It's the third part in a mini series that we've been doing at TestRail around test planning in 2021. I'm really excited today that we get to, after doing some other webinars about some more of the theory and test planning and practice, now we get to actually talk with folks who are doing this every day in the real world. So this is going to be really fun. So without further ado, I'm going to give a brief introduction of the folks who are on the panel today, and then we'll actually just jump right into the conversation. So Pablo Maurin is joining us today from Cardinal. He is the Director of Quality Assurance there, and he has experience across spanning a number of different types of systems and a number of different roles in regard to those systems as a developer, as a QA manager, everything from airborne delivery drones to autonomous vehicles. Cardinal has a really interesting model that Pablo will talk about today, and the changes and what that means for how they approach test planning is, I think, really helpful to hear about. So really excited to have Pablo here today. We're also joined by Robin Fay. Robin is coming from Germany, which is super exciting. We have a ton of folks in the industry are based in Europe, so I'm really glad that we're able to get someone on the panel who's able to kind of speak from that area. And Robin is currently working as the software quality manager at Nexible. They're in the e-commerce and insurance space, which is where Robin has worked in a sort of a development capacity and QA capacity for the last 6 years. And he's been charged at Nexible with coming up with the test management strategy, working on that move towards test automation. What can we automate? What can't we automate? How do we keep sort of agile framework for all of this? So really excited to have him join and weigh in on what Nexible's doing around test planning. And last but not least, one of our biggest sort of TestRail power users for a long time, you may have seen her chiming in on community from Srilata. Meka is joining us from UKG, where she is a senior Salesforce QA analyst. So she's going to bring some really awesome perspective on how you go about planning testing when you're serving in both sort of the IT side of an organization as well as the engineering side of the organization, and bring some really helpful ideas around how to make the most input given the sort of circumstances that you're in there. Love the motto that Srilata brings: no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. So without further ado, let's go ahead. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Awesome. All right, so you should see just the 4 beautiful mugs up here, and we'll jump off. So here's what I'd like to do to start. I gave a brief background for everyone, just so we've got some orientation, but I think it'd be really helpful if we could go around and talk in just a little bit more depth and hear from you, each of you panelists, how you would talk about the background or where you're coming at this idea of test planning from. So feel free to introduce yourself, and if I miss anything, if there's any more context to share about your personal background, how long you've been involved in QA and testing, what your current role is, and then maybe how you would characterize your current development process and testing process, and then what does QA look like on your teams? How have you organized your QA processes? What does your team makeup look like? That sort of general background for you and where you are coming into the question of software testing, that will serve as a good foundation for the rest of the conversation. So why don't we start? Pablo, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, no problem. Yeah, so first of all, my name is Pablo Maurin. My role is, like Matt had said previously, I'm the Director of QA at Cardinal. At Cardinal, we are a engineering services company. We help bring product to market for our customers. And what that really means, it means that we kind of cover the whole breadth of software development and engineering practices in general. We do everything from electrical engineering, embedded systems, cloud backend, mobile, both native as well as things like React Native, things of that nature. And so for us, we really need to cover this very, very wide breadth of skill sets. You know, we've got over 100 engineers that are actively working, of which approximately 20, maybe a little less than that currently, are actually doing tests of one form or another. So in our organization, we have people doing embedded software testing. We have some people that are doing cloud and mobile application testing. So, you know, some of the other things that you wanted to know is how do we approach test in general? You know, do we do an agile process? In general, yes, we do an agile process. There is a little hint of waterfall in the sense that when we take on a customer wants to know what we're working on, how long it's going to take, and what it'll take to complete it. So we do have to do some upfront estimation to provide them that answer. But when we are doing the active development, we're absolutely very much an agile shop. Yeah, I don't want to take up all the time for all the panelists, so maybe they can chime in on a little of their experience.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful background. How about you, Robin? What's your name, sort of background coming into Nexible, and then what does the current development or testing process look like in Nexible? Are there any particular tweaks or nuances to those processes at Nexible?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the quick introduction. My name is Robin, and I'm from Germany, working at Nexible since last summer. And yeah, our current status is we have a few Scrum teams who are working on the development, and yeah, based on that, we are trying to bring all of the test management and test planning into the teams, and that's why we are using TestRail, which helps us a lot with doing that. And a little bit about my background. I started working as a professional QA in 2015. I started as a consultant for testing and test automation, and after a few years, I started within a big e-commerce company here in Germany, where I earned a lot of experience when it comes to front-end testing, UI testing, and also load testing. And yeah, like I already mentioned, last year I started in a new area for me, which is the car insurance, which is the main business of Nexible. We have a strong focus on digitalization and automation. So we would like to achieve a very easy process for our customers, and that's why we also have a strong focus on test automation.
That's awesome. Thanks for the extra nuance of kind of where the testing is currently at, your overall test strategy at Nexible. That's great. All right, last but not least, Srilata. Tell us a little bit more about your role within UKG and your background in the testing space, and then we'll jump into some of the questions about how that maps onto what it looks like to actually plan testing.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Matt. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining this webinar. My name is Srilata Meka. I am a software quality assurance engineer at UKG, which is Ultimate Kronos Group. UKG is an American multinational software company which provides workforce and human capital management solutions. I'm a passionate software quality assurance engineer for almost 14 plus years with experience, as Matt has mentioned, in both the IT and the engineering model. I have been involved with TestRail since 2019. And after watching the first demo, I created the POC. And while doing the POC, customized the test case templates to map the fields to our IT service management or to the BRD, or to identify a test case as the regression candidate, or to identify if it was an automation candidate. So I had been involved with the QA tools, the evaluation, like the POCs, implementation, rollouts. That's one of the tasks which I had been involved in. Apart from from my QA career experience, involved with the manual testing and the automation. And coming to the UKG, we are in IT. We are like an IT QA team, and the QA members are aligned to specific service areas based on the business application which they support. And the methodology which we follow is a mix of waterfall and agile. So we support our business applications and customers. That's what mostly we do in the IT.
That's awesome. It's a really, I just can't believe that we were able to get connected with three folks who each are approaching testing in these very kind of specific models. It represents so well, I think, the range of different places where you would think about needing QA, or where these kind of practices get put into practice in the real world. So this is very exciting for us. With that sort of background and understanding where everybody's coming from, let's jump into some conversations more pointedly about how you plan your testing. So Srilata, obviously with folks aligned with that individual business tool or service area that you're supporting as an IT team, the way that these projects get rolled out or updates get changed might have a specific nuance there. I'm curious what test planning actually means for your team in that kind of context, and who's responsible for doing the actual planning side of the testing. Is there a particular format or process or documentation style that you use? Is there a particular process around which stakeholders are involved in the planning, and that sort of thing? Does that make sense?
Yes, Matt, it makes sense. In our org, usually the QA team members are responsible for planning, doing the test planning. And if it is a project which we are involved in, there is a project team with the BAs, the developers, the dev, the project, the team manager involved. But the QA members are the ones who do the test planning. And for me, the test planning mainly falls into two different categories. One is testing the new functionality. The second one is the regression testing. Now let's go to the new functionality testing. For the new functionality testing, the test planning involves a lot of QA prep. And the QA prep is around the scheduling the meetings with the BAs and the dev for the BRD overview. And after the requirement analysis is done, the test plan and the test cases are prepared. We do have a document for test plan, a template for test plan, and all of us write our test plans using the document, and test cases are written in the TestRail. And after that, these test plan and test cases are reviewed if the need arises with the whole project team, or if not, just with the BA and the dev. And we seek out for the approvals for the test plan and test cases. And sometimes it so happens that we need to create new data for our testing. So in those cases, the new test data creation is done. And I also check to see if any upstream or downstream applications are involved in the end-to-end testing. Do I have the access to them and get the access prior to my testing starts? So defect triage meetings are planned. This is for the new functionality testing. Now coming to the second one, which is the regression testing. I am a Salesforce QA analyst, and being in the Salesforce ecosystem, Salesforce releases this periodic releases. So we tend to do the regression testing for that, which the test planning for that involves updating the regression test suite, removing the unwanted test cases from that, and setting up the automation scripts so that it runs in the Salesforce preview sandbox, and scheduling meetings if any other working sessions are needed. So this is how I plan my testing. Over to you, Matt.
It's super helpful. I mean, it sounds like based on the sort of mission critical nature of the systems that you support, the QA planning process, the test planning process has to be pretty rigorous. You sort of have to really hold tight with those schedules, setting the meetings in advance where you're going to check back in on and defects that come up along the process, and actually producing a full test plan document along with the test cases and TestRail. Is that right?
Yes, Matt, you got it right. Yes, it is that whole test planning which we do.
That makes a lot of sense. Robin, how about for y'all where you're working in a bit more of, you're working more on the end product, it's more web-based and maybe even a bit smaller of a team than what Srilata might be supporting. Do you all use a similar level of rigor and have all these documents that you have to produce ahead of time, or how does your planning process look like and who is involved?
We have a general engineering process, which is valid for every team, and parts of the engineering process are the test automation and test process in a very rough way. But in general, the teams are responsible for the software they are delivering, and also that if another team works on something, we don't get any side effects on the product of another team. So every team is responsible to deliver their own test automation. I have a more kind of consultancy role in our company, and I'm supporting the teams if there are some general questions about the test process and how or if we have any concerns about the current test automation strategy or something like that. And I recommend all of teams that it's also always useful to speak as early as possible about the testing and to plan it as soon as possible and to involve every needed role within the discussions. So it's not only the developers who are talking to it about the testing, it's also useful to involve the business stakeholder or our DevOps colleagues, and yeah, that's it. Something what could be very complicated when it comes to agility, where we have a strong focus on, is bringing the test management into the plan. And I think we found a really good solution to do it. With TestRail, we have the possibility to report our test automation results on a strict level to our test management tool and give more transparency about what we are testing. And this way we reduce the redundancies when it comes to the manual testing, and we can really focus on the manual test sessions what we didn't test or what is not part of our test automation suite. And that's a big success we achieved within the last few months.
Yeah, I can definitely see the value of actually understanding what your automation is covering so that you know where the holes are, where you need to maybe spend a little bit more time on the more manual exploration.
Of course, we don't report all of the test results to TestRail, and that will be too much, especially when it comes to the unit testing. But on integration level or on end-to-end level, it's very helpful.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like establishing those lines of communication between you and the other QA folks with the developers, with the business has been really helpful. In this sort of agile process that you are currently running in the engineering team, do you have like a set meeting between QA and engineering? Is it on a regular basis, or is it more based on like around kind of a scrum that you're planning, or is it more just ad hoc in the planning phase? Or
we have a general meeting, the test automation community, where everyone who is working on the test automation and can get some input about the topic, which is every second week. This is one of our main meetings, but every other meeting is handled within the team. So the meeting, the test automation community is really for all the teams to speak about the current setup, but yeah, planning new test cases for new feature within a product is handled by the team on their own. And I'm joining a lot of the meetings for within the team to get some feedback about the current test planning.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense given the sort of rapid sort of agile development process that y'all are doing.
Yeah.
You're finding ways to be in a lot of those meetings in addition to the regular bi-weekly test automation meeting.
Correct.
That's awesome. Pablo, how does this look? What does test planning even mean when you're working on all of these different projects with these very different systems under test and potentially even different clients? Do you have a test planning process that you roll out across the different projects that y'all work on at Cardinal Peak, or what does that actually look like?
Yeah, so we do have a process, but it's generally fairly light. Like you said, the whatever we're testing, it's usually going to be very different from one customer to another. Testing a consumer electronics device is very different from testing a cloud deployed application. That should almost go without saying. So for us, what test planning really means, it means we just have to. First of all, we have to do it very quickly. Most of our projects have fairly well-defined end dates. We have to deliver something to our customer based on our statement of work. And we also have to be able to ramp up on the project very quickly. So once we have a project that we're working on, we have to get started very quickly. We have a very well-defined end date for delivery for our customer. So what that means for planning is that we have to be able to build our test plan, again, in a very quick manner with alignment to what it is that we're trying to accomplish for our customer, and be able to know that by the time that we get to the end, that we have a very high degree of confidence that what we're delivering to our customer is ready for manufacturing or ready for production, ready to be put on a website, ready to be released to, say, for example, something like the Apple App Store. And really that's our goal. So with respect to the planning, I want all of our testers to work directly with the development team. We usually have 1 or 2 testers assigned to each of our development projects, and the expectation is that they're going to be doing the testing together with the developers as the project is being developed. And maybe one thing that I should have noted in the beginning is that we get to work a lot of greenfield projects. Customer comes to us to say, I have an idea, or I want to develop this product, and we get to build it, for the most part from the ground up. Obviously, we do take on customers where we're building a new iteration of an existing product. And then once we finish, we do go into a support phase. But for the most part, our engagement is during that development. So we have that advantage going for us. You also mentioned test planning. We've talked about a little bit of the idea of manual versus automated. What it means that we are usually playing a balance between how much do we automate, which requires an upfront investment but pays dividends in the long run, versus do we tackle the testing manually because we have a reduced time frame. And that's definitely something that plays a role in terms of how do we plan out how we're going to test, what we're going to test, to what depth we're going to test. Is definitely something that feeds into it. So in general, we want to be able to have certain key concepts that we try to reuse, like sort of like pre-built templates. For example, we will do a lot of work in consumer electronics. Well, a lot of consumer electronics have batteries in them. I don't care what the product is, we need to be able to know what happens when the battery dies. How do you notify the user? If the battery is going to be in we'll call it a bad condition. For example, a hot battery trying to be overcharged means fire. Like, you don't want to do these things, and I don't care what product it is. Like these are normally standard set of tests that we have available to us. It also allows us to be able to bootstrap some of the test cases that we need. The reason, and I guess I want to mention that part of the reason I really like TestRail is because it lets us be able to capture those test cases and be able to assign them for execution manually. Or it also has a rich API that lets me be able to push in the test results from the automated scripts. And it's part of the reason I decided to use this as like the standard testing tool for the organization, even though we cover such a wide breadth of different disciplines.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense too. I mean, especially when you're moving as quickly as you have to move, using some of the heuristics that you've developed as a team, but then figuring out how to map that onto the actual test plan and having the flexibility to quickly scope out what you need to do, make decisions about what's going to be manual, versus what's automated, and make it really clear who's going to do what based on having actual test cases assigned to people, being able to script out what the test actually needs to accomplish. Seems like it's helpful there. With the experience that you've had now testing all these different systems, this one back to you, Pablo, and then we'll work back around. What would you say is one mistake that you've made around test planning in these projects, or one misconception that you had about what was going to be required for test planning that you've realized, that's not really what it's about, that you've learned the most from?
I guess, well, the biggest one is that it's never one and done, right? You don't go sit down and build your plan and think that you've somehow, have this perfect plan, execute the plan, and the product's done and ready to ship. It doesn't work that way. You're halfway through, you've discovered certain bugs, you have to update your plans for how you're going to address it. Customer priorities change, timelines change. A lot of issues happen during the development of a project. So the test plan is just another component of that development project. And so I would say the biggest one is that, yeah, it's never a one and done. You always have to be able to make adjustments as you move on. And really, it's just adjusting to the customer priorities, to the project priorities. So I did mention that a lot of the projects we work on are these greenfield projects, like that we basically get to work from the beginning. It's not. It's usually we're working with known technologies, and it's a matter of doing the implementation, getting projects released. However, even though that's the case, there's still some unknowns, right? We may have selected an initial technology in the beginning that may not really pan out the way we expected. And the reason, so the reason I mentioned this is that sometimes some of the work we are doing, even though it's development and there is this well-known target at the end, some of it is exploratory in nature, from both the software development standpoint and then necessarily feeding into it also for the testing of the application as a result. So anyway, I guess that's just really another side of the same coin. What I'm really saying is you have to be able to understand that projects change, technologies change, the implementation is going to change, and you just have to be able to be very flexible and accommodate and change the plan accordingly as you're doing your software development and the testing of the product that you're going to release.
Yeah, it sounds like you've developed some helpful heuristics along the way too that help guide, make sure that you're sticking to some of the core components that you need to be testing, even as the specifics might change along the way.
Yeah, and then maybe the other one, it's always have very good communication with your customer. Well, in our case, our customer is literally a paying customer. I imagine that in a product company, the customer will probably be the product owner, but the idea is still the same. You have to be able to communicate up and what the current status is and the current level of stability of what you're developing.
No, that totally makes sense. How about you, Robin? Biggest mistake or misconception that you previously had about test planning? What did you learn from it?
Yeah, sure. I think the biggest misconception I had in the beginning of my professional life was that it's not bad about getting asking for feedback and let other people review the test plans or test cases. And at the beginning, I wanted to deliver everything on my own, and in the end, it was not as close as perfect as I hoped it would be. And I think in the end, I would have saved a lot of time, especially my time I invested. Would I have asked for early feedback and yeah, let the test plans getting a review.
In line with some of that, what you had said earlier too about having that tight communication with the developers, with the business analysts.
Yeah, correct.
Getting there but earlier on. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, it seems like with the pace that a lot of folks are having to ship product these days too, there's fewer and fewer teams that have the time to write everything out ahead of time. So that definitely dovetails into a number of things that we're hearing from a lot of other users of TestRail these days too. Srilata, how about you? One mistake or misconception that you had about test planning that you feel like you've learned the most from?
The one misconception which I had was while providing the level of effort for the test planning, there were like so many factors to be considered for providing the QA LOE, and there was a miss on my side to consider all the factors. So with my experience, what I see is that like few of the criteria, not like all from my experience, you know what, like have a component sizing guidelines so that you know like which one is a low, medium, high or very high, like, you know, efforts which would need for the validation. And in the component sizing, like, you know, which consists of like the test prep, test data creation, defect analysis, requirement analysis, all these fall under the component sizing. And the second one is adding the gauging the complexity of the project and adding the complexity uplift to your QA LOE. And few of the examples are like distributed teams having clear, concise requirements, or like dependencies on third-party vendors, end-to-end applications, incremental deployments, and the experience level of the project team members. So this constitutes the complexity uplift. And the third and the most important thing, which I always missed, was adding the contingency uplift. like currently, like what we are seeing, what's going around in the world, like, with the resource allocation, having a contingency uplift is very, very important. Even under normal conditions, we need to buffer in the extra time, for the QA validation. So the QA LOE is an aggregate of the component sizing, the complexity uplift, and the contingency uplift. This is going to set the QA team or the QA resource up for success.
It is awesome that y'all have actually been able to build a process around that, because I could see that being really tricky. How do you account for all of these different areas that could change project by project, or how do you make sure that you're taking those into account into a test plan? Because a lot of the templates that you'll see are just about the system under test. Maybe there's a question about, do you have access to the other systems? Do you have the data you need to test? There aren't usually questions about, did you make sure to account for the increased level of effort based on these different parameters?
Matt, we have actually conceived a QA LOE tool, like, an estimator tool, and all these guidelines are like, in that. Like, what does like low effort for testing means, how many number of test cases, what is the application, like, if it is like a medium level from the component sizing, what is it? So like for each of the tasks, that is like, let it be like, the requirement analysis or the test plan or the test case preparation, we have given like certain numbers to it, like the percentages to it. And then based on that, there's a formula set based on like the low, medium, high, very high, we calculate the QA LOE. So there is a guideline which we have like worked on and set for this QA estimator tool.
That's awesome. Talk about taking a misconception and learning as much as you can from it so that you don't make it again. I love it. All right. We've had a couple interesting questions come in the Q&A panel, and I think we might even have time to see what y'all think about them right at the end. But before we do that, just as sort of a last sort of concluding statement based on the conversation we've had so far, I'd be curious to hear what each of you would share as maybe your top 2 or 3 pieces of advice, or maybe it's even just one. Like if you were giving advice to yourself earlier in your career or on a new project, what's 1 or 2 or 3 pieces of advice you would share to help improve that process around planning? And it may be some of what you've already said, right? But just as sort of a pulling it all together. So Srilata, let's start with you if you feel comfortable. Do you have any parting pieces of wisdom that you think might help somebody improve their test planning process from this conversation?
Matt, I know you have mentioned to share one, but it is very hard to share one. So I'll share very quickly few of them. So adopting the shift left approach. You know what? This is very beneficial for an efficient test planning if the QA is involved right from the beginning in the phase of a project. The second one is practicing the 3 amigos concept. Involve the BSA, the dev, like, in every phase of the QA lifecycle, from like, test cases, test plan review to defect triages to test case results review. I strongly believe in the 3 amigos concept and I practice it. And the third one is regression testing. Do not forget to do the regression testing after defect verification, or in case of like, ITs, before the user acceptance testing, doing the regression testing of the existing feature or like, the current new functionality. And in case of like engineering, do not forget to do the regression testing before the release. This is one thing which I would say. And one last thing is, Matt, communicate the risks. When you see the red flags, communicate the risks early and often. Last but not least is always set the stage, always define the exit and the entry criteria for QA testing. Share it in the test plan. Let the project team know what's the entry and the exit criteria for your testing is. So plan, 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 and this will set us up for success.
That's
Over to
great.
you,
I'm
Matt.
glad you didn't. I'm glad you didn't just limit it to one, because all of those pieces of advice I think are super helpful and very tangible. So thank you. Robin, how about you? If you were to share a couple pieces of advice that you think a team could use to start improving their test planning process just right from this call, what would you say?
Yeah. It's very hard to add something more to this topic, because what Srilata mentioned was very professional, and I think that's always valid. I would add communication and transparency, because from my point of view, if everyone understands why testing is so much important, especially when it comes to a single feature, everyone is eager to support and to improve the test plans and the test automation.
That's great. Yeah, I know it sounds, especially like on a project that moves at the pace that your projects are with all these different teams, that establishing those lines of communication early on seems to be really crucial.
Yeah.
Pablo, how about you? I mean, you've talked about a lot of the different areas that you've had to adapt your team's testing process, given the fact that you sometimes work on greenfield projects. A lot of these projects have pretty tight timelines with defined endpoints. Any pieces of advice you would share around the test planning process that you've learned from all those different projects?
Yeah, yes, I have one big one, but I also want to say I agree with everything what Srilata said, and specifically the communication aspect. I mean, I know we touched on that earlier. Communicating to the stakeholders, communicate to the team, communicate risk, communicate to your customers. That you just can't overstress that. The other the other piece of advice that I would also give is remember why you're doing this. At the end of the day, it's going to be about that end product for that end user, and that should really be ultimately the driver for all the test plans, all the test execution, what it is that you're building. It's really all about that end user experience. Don't over compartmentalize, just always remember that it's the end user experience that matters.
Thanks. Yeah, that is kind of a thing that's easy to lose sight of, no matter what you're doing, whether you're testing or building products or writing documentation or coming up with marketing plans. The like question of what's the value to the end user seems like one of the easiest ones to forget, but it's the reason that we're all here doing any of this anyway. So I appreciate that that note to tie it off. All right, well, we have 15 minutes, and there's been some interesting questions coming in the QA panel. Are y'all up for trying out some questions live here?
Yeah, do it.
Cool. So there's one, I'm going to paraphrase a couple different people's questions, because we've had a couple of questions on this point. And I'll try to put the question together, and then whoever feels like they have a good response ready, go ahead, jump in, and then we'll see if anybody else wants to chime in. There's been a couple of questions about test planning in an agile environment, and in particular, whether y'all have found it beneficial. Do you do some kind of test planning for every single user story? Do you do test plans for every agile sprint or scrum sprint? Or is the test planning more for the overall release as opposed to being tied to each individual story or each individual sprint? Or how do you think about what planning looks like in that context? Does anybody have any initial thoughts that they want to jump in and share?
I'm saying that I think that's a really good question. I think it's a very difficult question. Obviously, it'll depend highly on your organization and your expectations. You know, at Cardinal Peak, we do want to create an overall test plan. And really what I'm calling the test plan in this case is really sort of that exit criteria that Srilata was talking about with respect to the tests that we would define that when they all pass, have that high degree of confidence that we're ready to be able to give it to our customer and be able to say, yes, the product is completed to the satisfaction of what we'd agree that we're going to work on. That ties into what we've already discussed a couple of times, was just the regression testing. That's still very hand wavy, very broad answer. You asked, do you plan for every story? I think it's a good idea to have a test, but I don't know that necessarily the test must be one test per story. Like a one-to-one correspondence doesn't necessarily make sense always. If you have a specific bug, then you probably do want to have a specific test case for that one bug, again, so you can catch it in your regression. Do you plan per sprint? The way we normally do it is there's kind of during the sprint development, we kind of have two phases of testing, if you will. There's the regression testing, because we want to make sure that we haven't broken anything. And usually we do that very, very early on in the sprint before the developers have been able to complete any tasks or that any of the new development that the developers are doing. So we usually try to get regression very early on in the sprint. And then from the things that came from the previous sprint. And then as new features are coming in, we either write new test cases or do exploratory testing on the new development that has already been developed by the developers. Often that will be done. So the key point there that I'm looking for from our test engineers is quick feedback back to the developers. And that quick feedback, I just want to know, get that feature tested. And I don't necessarily say automated or manual. I just say get the features tested, provide the feedback quickly, because it is the responsibility of the entire team, whether it be developers, testers, whatever, I don't care what hat you're wearing, to be able to get it done to completion before the end of the sprint. Once that is done and we have the feedback provided, then we can work on automating it so that we don't have to be doing it manually in the future. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's kind of the approach that we usually take. And like I said, it's a hard problem on how and when you test things and you align properly with the sprints and your developers.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's kind of two levels that it's operating, at least that I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard there's the sort of higher level where you're talking about what's the entry and exit generally. But then there's also maybe the lower level that might correspond with actual sprint cadence of, okay, generally we try to organize our regression testing earlier on in the sprint, so that way, as the developers are actually starting to push code later in the sprint, we can be focusing the efforts on the exploratory or the sort of new code. Like Srilata mentioned earlier, that breakdown of testing new features versus regression testing, being able to plan your efforts in accordance with, to some extent, with the sprint cadence, because you kind of have this understanding early in the sprint, the developers might not have new stuff to test yet. That's a good time to get into regression. And then we can focus on the new code that they're developing at the end and then sort of do that iteratively. Did I get that right? Sort of that higher level plan of the overall what needs to be tested to deliver the high quality product and scope of the requirements, but then also that sort of cadence that you might run in terms of actually carrying out, or how you might plan efforts in line with the sprint cadence.
Yeah, and if I was to, I mean, basically, yes. From a high level, the long-term project goal is really more about the strategic delivery of the product that we're trying to deliver for our customer in a timely manner. And then the specifics on like the individual story or even at the sprint level, it's about that tactical execution for the immediate problem at hand.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. What about you, Robin or Srilata? Anything that you want to add around how closely you tie your test planning to individual sprint stories or epics or Scrum sprints themselves?
I can get a little bit of insights about how we handle it. On a story level, we only focus on the specific feature and create test cases. Mostly of them are in this phase of development. They are only manual test cases, but afterwards we are trying to automate as much as possible and add them to our regression test suite. And when it comes to a release, it's pretty easy to plan it. Of course, we have our regression tests, which we split in the integration tests and the end-to-end tests. And that's also one of the benefits we get from TestRail. We are able to create multiple test runs, one for the integration test, one for the end-to-end test, and one additional for a new feature, which is including the manual test cases or set of test cases. And it's possible to combine them within a milestone and to have every single test run within it. And that makes it very transparent and helps us a lot for planning.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely something that we've heard from a number of users. A lot of times, maybe the individual test run might be used, whether it's some of those more overarching test efforts like the end-to-end or integration testing that might happen a few times in a release, but maybe not every single sprint of a release. They'll typically do a milestone, and TestRail might correlate with the actual release target in, let's say Jira, if that's what you're using to track your project. You might have that tied to an epic or something like that. And then the individual test runs might be, okay, what are we actually going to be testing either in this 2-week sprint, or making sure that you have a plan for, okay, we know at some point in this release process, we need to do the integration testing. So we'll plan that out in this test run. We know that it's going to come at some point before the release happens. We can carry out the testing that we do during the sprints, more of that exploratory kind of testing in the test runs that might be in the same milestone, but be segregated to, okay, this 2-week sprint, we're going to be actually doing these tests. Sounds similar to what you guys are doing at Nexible.
Yeah, so that explains it very well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. All right, Srilata, anything else that you want to add on the Agile side?
Pablo and Robin have well explained the question. Just to add to it, from one of my experiences, in Agile methodology, how did we do the test planning? We kind of it was a 3-week sprint, and 2 weeks of the sprint was used for manual testing and regression testing, and the last week of the sprint was used for automation. So we covered both the manual testing and the automation, and checked in our code at the end into back then we were using the TFS. So this is how we did. We utilized the 3-week sprint for both the manual testing and automating the user story.
Yeah, that's super helpful. We actually just had somebody ask a similar question about exactly when do you do the regression testing on the stuff that's been developed. So I think that was great. You read their mind, Srilata. All right, we have just a few minutes left. There's another theme, so we won't be able to answer all the questions. There's one other theme that I think it would be helpful for us to talk about that's come up in a couple questions, and that's what level of detail do you get in the planning phase? So there's a couple nuances to this. One person asked, do you actually write out all of the test cases in TestRail? Because that could maybe be too time consuming to have to write them out for every single user story, or what level of detail do you actually write out in the test plan document, or if you're using test cases in TestRail to plan? And then another element of that is, what level of detail do you get into the individual test cases? Is it just a title, or do you try to specify the preconditions or expected results, or even the steps to testing that case? Do you get to that level of detail in a test case during planning? And then if you're doing your test planning outside of TestRail, is it how lengthy of a document is that? Like, do you try to write it all out still these days, or do you try to keep it to a shorter document? Is it more of a mind map? So a lot of different ways to approach this question, but the general sort of theme here is what level of detail, what level of complexity do you get at what stage? Anybody have any initial thoughts they want to jump in on?
Matt, like having a lean test plan is the best thing to do, because if you write too many details in the test plan, nobody is going to read it, and they'll be asking you, is it a template? You know what? And they'll lose the interest. So have a lean test plan and see that what is needed is only added in the test plan. But coming to the test cases, adding details is very much needed, because what I tend to do is that I export the test cases and share it with my business users. They're used as UAT scripts. And sometimes, you know what, if my testing task has to be assigned to another tester, having detailed test cases is very helpful for the new tester who is on board to understand what needs to be tested. So I tend to add like details, the preconditions, the profiles, like, you know, the test, the database query, the steps to reproduce into my test cases. And the same thing was when we used to, prior to TestRail, when we maintained our test cases in a spreadsheet, I used to add all the details. Over to you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Srilata. Pablo?
Yeah, these are awesome questions. It depends a lot in our case on the customer and with the nature of what we're working on. I'll say that I'll just try to cover a couple of the main points because I know we don't have a whole lot of time. I think it depends highly. First of all, I agree fully. Keep your big high-level document very lean. I feel the same about wikis actually, in that they get out of date and people don't read them in a lot of detail, and so you should really contain the actual detail in the TestRail tool or whatever tool you're using. The plan should be pretty lean. In terms of the level of detail for each test case, I think it depends highly on the team that is going to be doing the execution. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I've got one project, small team, one developer, one tester. Tester is very, very capable. You know, I prefer that, and the time frame that I have on that project is very small. You have to be able to turn around on this project in 6 months. I don't have the time to build a super deep, rich test case with exact steps. And instead, what I have is kind of like broad stroke, exploratory testing style, and in my TestRail, and I trust that this individual is going to do a good job of having the coverage we need. I've got another customer where we're actually supporting a medical product. It has about a 2-year time frame before the product goes to market. There's regulatory concerns that are on top of it. You better believe we've got detail in those test cases. Even though it's a small team of only 2 testers, every single last little minutia is documented with traceability back to specific product requirements, and every single step must be documented because it's a regulatory concern that oversees it. And this kind of is what I was saying, that it kind of depends on the time frame. It depends on the individuals. It depends on where you're going to be deploying this. So if I had to, you know, not knowing the specifics of what the person is doing in general, I'm going to say if it's going to be manual testing in a large team, then more detail is better. It gives you reproducibility. If it's going to be small and fast team, less detail. And I guess the last thing I would say is if you're doing automated testing, that minutia level of detail at the most extreme down level like the smallest level of detail, I expect that to be captured in your script. So in the TestRail, no, I would not include that detail, but the reason is because it should be captured in your actual program.
That's super helpful. I really appreciate the nuance on those different situations, because that does seem like it really drives a lot of what you're going to need to do in terms of level of complexity. Is how senior is the person? Are you working with folks that are maybe external QA and don't know as much about the product and really need to be explicitly told every single step? Or is it somebody who's a little bit more tight with the developer and can focus on the exploratory side? So that's super helpful. We're just a couple minutes over time. Robin, I don't know if there was anything that you wanted to share on this last question before we wrap up.
I think Pablo explained it very well, so I don't see any need to extend it a little bit more. The only thing I would mention is really there's a big it depends on it. So always question about who will test it and for what is the test documentation needed.
I literally could not have found a better statement to wrap up the entire mini series that we did on test planning, but what you just said, Robin, it all depends on who's doing it and for why we need this documentation in the first place. So with that, thank you, all three of you, for your time and generous sharing of advice and experience. For those of you who are still with us on the call, the links to the recordings, both for this session as well as the past two that we did on test planning, will be shared in the follow-up email. Feel free to reach out to us. If you have any comments or questions, you can reach our team at contact@gurok.com, or you can respond to the emails that you get after the session. You can respond and those go straight to us. If you'd like to see more webinars or discussion forums around this topic or this style of conversation around other topics, let us know. You'll have an opportunity to submit a survey at the end of the webinar. Let us know what you'd like to see, because we're planning to do more of these over the next couple months, over the next couple quarters. So do feel free to share what else you'd like to see some conversations organized around, because at least for me, this has been super helpful to hear from folks who are actually in it day to day. And I think being able to kind of share as a community is super helpful. So let us know. In the meantime, you can contact us if you need anything else. And other than that, have a wonderful rest of your day and wonderful week. Srilata, Robin, Pablo, thank you again so much. Look forward to working with you again on some projects like this in the future.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye all.
Bye.
Take care.